Now, we all know it's very easy for a driver or team to point the finger and divert the blame away from themselves. And one of the main topics of conversation right now is the increasingly difficult relationship between Lewis Hamilton and Ferrari. Hamilton being the most successful driver ever in terms of numbers, and Ferrari the most iconic, easily out of the bunch. Now, a group of people in a boardroom decided to marry these entities together because what could possibly go wrong? This was surely an instant recipe for success. After all, no bad decision has ever come out of a boardroom, has it? But so far, this much anticipated relationship has been a shambles. Okay, it's made both parties a lot of money and shifted a lot of merch and all this sort of stuff, but it hasn't set the world on fire as intended. And why is this, you say? Well, I'm glad that you asked, because in my eyes, both parties are equally guilty of screwing this up. Hamilton and Ferrari did this all to themselves. So I'm Paul, this is the Gridgab, and let's unpack this massively strange situation. Now, to do this, let's do a very quick sit rep just to remind us all how we got to this very situation in the first place. Now, prior to the 2024 season, whilst appearing to be enshrined at Mercedes for life, it suddenly announced that Lewis is off to Maranello for 2025, leaving a very confused Toto Wolff and a quite pleased George Russell behind him. Now, I'm no financial expert, but some very good money-related things happened at Ferrari shortly after the announcement. And once free of his Mercedes commitments, he was unveiled to the world in Ferrari colours like it was the second coming. Meanwhile, Charles Leclerc was probably at home in Monaco, laughing his head off, probably thinking he has no idea of what he's walking into. The expectation was built up, and the hype was so enormous that the conversation switched immediately to race wins, championships, and the conversion of matter to sheer energy. But unfortunately, Hamilton and Ferrari seem to have forgotten some things from the last few years, and it is that both are shadows of what they once were. Yeah, I know it's controversial, but let's face it, it's the truth. From the start of the season up until now, it's really not been that far off a disaster, especially considering what the expectations were. And also when you consider how he's been doing against his much less experienced teammate, Charles Leclerc. So all in all, on-track performances have fallen well short. And yes, there was a sprint race win, but I would attribute that more to Hamilton just getting on with it, using the SF25's decent one-lap pace and the Ferrari strategy team not really being required. There wasn't really much for them to screw up that time. But in regards to everything else, the whole thing so far has been a very well funded, very well publicised and very well deluded septic tank. The disagreements that we've seen between Hamilton and his race engineer Adami over the radio has also led to bitchy, sarcastic and some very odd comments and behaviour from both parties. It was funny at first, but it was actually quite sad to see, especially race after race, especially also at this level. And as we've seen before, driver and race engineer need to be 100% on the same page, understanding each other and also anticipating what the other needs. Complete chemistry is needed on every level. And also trust. Let's of course not forget trust, because the increasing lack of it that I'm sensing and seeing between Hamilton and Adami and also the Ferrari team on the whole is astonishing. And so this brings us up to now, and also the argument that Hamilton and Ferrari did this all to themselves, and the main cause is that both failed to compromise and meet in the middle. From what I can see, neither party are willing to accept that they are no longer the best. Both of them still think they're great, and this is actually very damaging. Now, of course, at this level, you do have to think very, very highly of yourself. Of course you do, but there's still a fine line between confident and tragically deluded. No, I'm not being nasty, of course. If you read F1 history or stats, Hamilton and Ferrari are up there with the absolute greatest, if not the greatest. Two of F1's biggest, greatest names, and that goes without saying. But on the other hand, if you look at the Drivers' and Constructors' Championships for the last 3 or 4 years, that says something very, very different and tells a very different story altogether. And also says something very interesting about the state of both driver and team. With Hamilton, of course, getting outscored by Russell on the regular at Mercedes, and Ferrari just getting schooled by teams that are much, much less funded. So right now, there's every indication that both driver and team are where they want to be, but the problem is neither of them are willing to stop drinking the Kool-Aid for 2 seconds and smelling their own farts. And if they could just do that and accept the situation, that's when the growing and the healing process can begin. Honestly, the lack of self-awareness from both parties here has been astonishing, but also yet not surprising, because of course in the initial contract negotiations, both Hamilton and Ferrari needed to have as much of a commanding position as possible, which also involves selling and believing your own bullshit and not really being willing to face up to reality. And when you combine all this with this weird trend that we see right now, where it doesn't matter if it's Hamilton, Ferrari, big celebrities, multinational businesses, all of them are full of yes men who will happily push through and sign off big, massive decisions that are clearly terrible. And I'm sure you might even see this yourself at work in your own job, where some decisions are so bizarre that it's amazing no one stood up and said, actually, do you know what? This really isn't a good idea. Because of course, if you do that, well, you get fired. So the long and short of it now is that Ferrari and Hamilton both believed their own bullshit and surrounded themselves with yes men who told them that they were great, and this has led us to the situation that we are in now. Now, I'm not totally naive. F1, of course, is money, and everybody in the sport loves a payday, and it was simply much more lucrative to make the move between Hamilton and Ferrari happen than not doing it. But if there was just somebody at Team Hamilton that just pulled him aside and said, look, you're going to be 40 years old. There isn't enough time to build empires at Ferrari. And with Mercedes, yeah, of course, it's not perfect, but you are going to have a payday in some shape or form for the rest of your life. The grass, of course, isn't always greener, and that is probably exactly what someone should have told him. And then at Ferrari, if someone piped up and said, look, Charles Leclerc is our guy. He's on a massive long-term contract. He's going to be our guy moving forward, but Carlos Sainz is worth hanging on to. The dynamic between them worked most of the time, and Carlos could still give us another 5 years, which of course Lewis can't. But the trouble is, neither of those points make serious amounts of dosh, and were probably not given much consideration once the revenue projections finally came in. But even after everything we've seen this year, I do still have a shred of a feeling that Hamilton and Ferrari could still work, perhaps in 2026 when the new regulations come in, but also they might just be able to patch things up and turn things around for the remainder of 2025. They'd have to manage expectations, obviously, but the sheer amount of change and realization needed would be enormous. Everyone just needs to come together and admit that it's crap, it's rubbish, and it's not working. And what can we do to fix it? Leave the egos and blame game at home, make a compromise and sort the bloody thing out. In contrast to this, let's look at when Schumacher joined Ferrari for 1996. It was a total rip it down and start again kind of operation. The difference is Michael had time on his hands, whereas Lewis doesn't. Time, of course, is running out, but also Ferrari and Hamilton need to decide if they are both willing to change for the other. Now, of course, no driver is ever bigger than the team, but in this sense, Ferrari does need to give a little bit more leeway to help deprogram Hamilton from his Mercedes habits and mindsets. But on the flip side, Hamilton must realise that he's effectively driving for a country now, and not a car manufacturer that could leave F1 at the drop of a hat if car sales ever dropped off. And I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. Ferrari probably have adjusted a few things, but for the most part, Hamilton just needs to get with the program. Exactly in the same way that Charles Leclerc has, and who, by the way, will probably have the shock of his life when he eventually leaves Ferrari and sees how other teams operate. Right, so we've seen that it started with positivity and has been declining ever since. Can anything be done to salvage the partnership between Hamilton and Ferrari? In regards though to Lewis Hamilton on his own, nothing I sense can be salvaged unless he looks deep inside himself and decides if this is still something he truly wants. Does he still have the capacity to change or even the desire to do so? Was he even expecting this Ferrari stint to require this much work? I'd say probably not. Let's not forget, of course, Hamilton grew up watching the sheer perfection of the Ferrari operation under Jean Todt, Ross Brawn and Michael Schumacher, and understandably wanted to have Ferrari on his resume. But the Ferrari he found himself in is probably nothing short of a driver wrecker. One, of course, that broke the spirits of Fernando Alonso, Kimi Raikkonen, Sebastian Vettel, etc., etc. The list will go on forevermore. So the sheer undertaking of change required by Lewis Hamilton at this point to drop everything he's learned at Mercedes, get with the Ferrari program, is probably impossible or close to it. Or even just to get into a similar sort of mindset as Charles Leclerc, who of course seems to just be quietly getting on with it, even though visibly, clearly, his heart and mind were broken a long time ago. And I doubt that Hamilton will allow this to happen to himself. He's just too big. Because of course to him, there's an element of Ferrari having to get with the Hamilton program as much as the other way around. But then what about Ferrari? Because I sense Fred Vasseur urgently needs to fix Hamilton's side of the garage and all the squabbling that seems to be going on there. Hamilton, Riccardo Adami, and all the other relevant crew not only need to accept each other, but also build that respect for each other too. They can of course say lovely things in PR interviews and everything, but over the team radio over the course of a race, all the reality of the situation comes spewing out, as we've seen so far this season. Who knows, perhaps after the season ends, send them all to a remote island or a mountain peak where they simply must work together in order to bond and survive. But Ferrari's biggest error by a mile, and I've said this in videos before, is I sense that they massively underestimated what you get when you sign a driver like Lewis Hamilton. Now, of course, you get the driver and his ability, but also the additional fame, celebrity, an army of fans that see him as godlike and also get very annoyed if you do him wrong or say anything negative about him whatsoever. Ferrari haven't dealt with this sort of thing before and might have an interesting time if the season continues as we've already seen. Ferrari's model seems to be sign a driver, pay him millions of dollars, program him into the Ferrari way, and if he's successful, give him a Ferrari F40, and if he's not successful, fire him and bring in another guy. And that strategy I don't think seems to wash with a driver like Hamilton. And so with that, Ferrari, I'm not sure knew what they were really walking into. Blinded of course by the revenue projection, stock market reports, and also of course the yes men, which I mentioned earlier. And so with that, Ferrari just might have to realise that they need to adapt and compromise much more than they would normally with another driver. But the sad thing and the reality is I just don't think they are willing to do this, especially with Charles Leclerc in one seat and a queue of drivers who would happily jump into the seat alongside him. And so finally, the reality and the biggest tragedy here is that Ferrari really should have signed Hamilton 10 years ago. They of course brought him in now, and they are trying to bring a spark into existence where the conditions to do so are now simply impossible. Ferrari wanted of course the Lewis Hamilton from 2014 to 2021 and is looking more and more like this driver is gone forever. But you never know, things might improve slightly. Hamilton could even get a podium or perhaps even a win in a particularly messy wet weather race. But even if that happens, it won't detract from the situation that Hamilton and Ferrari are showing a lack of willing to budge and accommodate the other. But it's time now to let me know what you think in the comments below. Can this whole thing be turned around? Can Ferrari and Hamilton come together and show unity and press forward and just draw a line? Or is it just doomed to be resigned to another Ferrari world champion driver failure? Let me know below. Thank you so much for watching. Do leave a like if you enjoyed. And of course, I'm Paul, this is the Gridgab, and I'll see you later. Cheers.